Hi everyone, this is Orly, and welcome to Introduction to Communication Media. And today we're going to talk about the factors affecting communication. As you can see, I think at this point you're already done with reading the reading material that was uploaded in the website. So probably by now you already have an idea what a communication process is and what are the areas and what are the elements that are affecting actual actual communication. So at this point, what we're going to do is that we are going to look at the factors affecting communication. What are the elements that affect communication or that cause communication breakdown? Excuse me. So we're going to go through this presentation, and hopefully you will be able um, to grasp as many information as possible, because there's going to be a quiz and a discussion immediately after this. So the title of our presentation for today is Factors Affecting Communication. And these are the surrounding elements in the communication experience. Was there ever a time when you were, talking to someone and it was noisy in your immediate environment? When you say immediate environment, ito yung nasa paligid mo. And there were times where when you were talking to someone and you were not feeling well. So those are the things that could be affecting you or your listener. So these are the factors that we will be talking about. As a matter of fact, it's not just only noise, as well as it's not just about you not feeling well that would affect communication, but there are so many other things. All right, so let's continue. Our objectives for this presentation is first to know and identify the factors affecting conversation, and we will connect these factors with the participants or the interlocutors in the communication process, and then we'll try to address these problems to ensure that effective communication occurs. But before that, let's just have a recap of the reading material that you have just read regarding an introduction to communication. Let's just have a review. We have learned that effective communication is a two-way process. So you see, guys, it's always two ways. It's mutual. It's a give and take. How would I put it? Um, there's there's a person there's a sender and there's a receiver. As you can see, it's very important to understand that communication is always two ways. It doesn't mean na dapat dalawang tao lang ang involved sa communication. Of course, we have different types of communication, which is like mass media or small group discussions. But we'll be talking about that soon. But what's important is that um, we establish the principle of communication being two ways because um, merong sender at merong receiver. Alright? Sometimes marami yung sender, sometimes isa lang yung receiver. On the other hand, there could also be instances wherein isa lang yung sender, tapos marami yung receiver. Alright? But then again, we call it a two-way process because um, there's just a sender and then the receiver. The receiver, when the receiver responds or replies to the message, siya na ngayon yung sender. Alright? So it's a circular process, it's a cyclic process. It is important to have a common perception between the two participants regarding a message. It is important to have a common perception between the two participants regarding the message. What do we mean by this? It means that whenever we try to communicate, it is important that we share the same insights. Sometimes we don't share the same insights, but if only the sender will make sure, if only the sender will make sure that he or she gets understood, the level of perception or the field of perception could widen and there would be understanding. And the fourth one is There are three basic elements, and these are the sender, the message, and the receiver. The sender is the one who sends the message. The message is the idea or the thought processed inside the sender, transferred probably orally or through written communication, and then received by someone who is listening or probably reading or probably watching. Okay? So generally, that's a recap. Now, as mentioned in our previous study, there is this what we call the communication breakdown. And when there's a communication breakdown, um, and when there's a communication breakdown, it's kind of it's actually more of a challenge whenever we try to um, gather as much thought on how we're going to go back to establishing the communication process or the interaction. That's why it's very important that we know that there is the idea or the phenomenon that we call the communication breakdowns. And communication breakdowns are situations where the message isn't sent across, and then there were times when the sender's idea is perceived differently by the receiver. That is why it is important to identify some factors affecting communication breakdowns. Okay, now, what are the factors affecting communication? So, there are many different things. Actually, I think I prepared like 10 factors, but there are actually more. But we could start off with 10. And I'd like you to take notes while watching this video because this is relatively important because there's going to be a quiz after this. First, the status or role. So you see, if the two people involved in a communication, involved in a conversation, do not share the same status or role, it could be an interference. So participants may be of equal status within an environment or they may not. Example probably could be a boss and an employee. This difference in status sometimes affects the effectiveness of the communication process. All right. The second one is cultural differences. Whenever we talk to someone who came from a different culture, sometimes it could be hard for us to express ourselves, or sometimes it would be harder. It could also be harder for those who are listening to us. So sometimes our receivers who would come from different cultures would find it a hard time to understand what we're saying because this may mean different things. Next would be choice of communication channels. Sometimes ineffective choice of communication channels can send out the wrong signals. All right. Um, there are times whenever we would send messages via chat or via Facebook, or sometimes we would post with all the good intentions on Facebook. On the other hand, we would have friends, we would have family members who would react differently because of the tone of our voice or the tone of our writing, without them realizing that we just typed it with all the good intentions. So it's very important that we also consider the effective choice of communication channels whenever we would send a message. Okay. Next would be the length of communication. It's very important that a sender and a receiver be very wary as to how long would a communication or an interaction would take place. I have probably you've already encountered a very long sermon or a very long lecture. Generally, human beings only have at least 8 minutes of pure attention. After that, everything goes wiry. And every sender, every every communication major has to be very aware of that. The length of the message also affects the communication process. Shortening or being more concise in your messages could ensure the clarity of your message. All right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that, you're an effective speaker because you had had a long sermon or you had had a long report. Um, it's actually a matter of being concise. It's a matter of being efficient and being very short, simple, but straight. Okay. Let's continue. Next would be the use of language. Of course, language is generally our tool to communicate to people. But then again, if you think about it, language could also be a barrier. It could also be an interference. I remember when I was working in a call center, I used to call my customers ma'am, I, female customers ma'am or madam. It's just that eventually I realized that in the United States, if you call if you call if you call a female customer ma'am, the understanding, what do you call this, the the reflection is I'm looking at her as someone who is already old, which is kind of offensive. All right. Another would be, look at the example that I had here. Woman, comma, without her, comma, man is nothing, versus woman, comma, without her man, comma, is nothing. Let me read it without the commas. Woman, without her, man is nothing. Woman, without her man, is nothing. What's the difference? Go figure it out for yourself. So you see, this is the reason why we have to be very wary about our grammar, about our punctuations, our misspelled words, especially when it comes to written communication. Next would be disabilities. Of course, there would be some people who are, these are what you call the PWDs, or the people living with disabilities, or what we call the differently able. Impaired sight, dyslexia, or poor mental health can be barriers to good communication. All right, and as messengers as messengers or senders of messages, we have to be wary about it. These factors should be taken into consideration when evaluating the effectiveness of communication. Considering the use of communication tools like hearing aids, sign language, magnifying systems, and symbols can help strengthen communication. Next would be known or unknown receiver. You know what, guys? Um, there's there are moments in communication wherein you do not know who's going to receive the message. Like, let's say, for example, you just sent a blast email to like 100 email addresses. Yes, you know the addresses, probably or probably not. Probably you just copy pasted it from a database of email addresses. But the point is that you do not know the behavior. You do not know who these people are. So it's also important that you have to share the same schema. Schema is a preconceived knowledge. It's more of like knowing where they are and somewhat knowing what they already know. Because that is the key to making them understand or persuading them with what you want them to to what do you call this, to know, what you want them to know, or what you want them to understand. Okay, as we continue on, we will also be looking at the different behaviors and attitudes of people. Sometimes we will be talking to people who are not as enthusiastic as we are. And it is also one thing that we have to consider. Effective communication needs to take into consideration the age, the personality type, and the preference style of the participants in a conversation. So you see, it's more of like you talking to your parents. There's a very big age gap. So if you'll be using your common day jargon to them, it could possibly be an interference to communication with them. Elders have different conversation preferences with children, and that's why it is very important to be very aware of the receiver's auditory, visual, or kinesthetic style. How would I put it? There are some people who listen better, and there are people who could listen better if they could see something. Someone who listens well is someone who's auditory, someone who would prefer seeing something visual, like what we're doing right now, um, is is a visual learner. A kinesthetic learner, on the other hand, is someone who wants to move around, who wants to, like walk, talk, respond, provide feedback, and that's a kinesthetic learner. Second to the last, also, would be your atmosphere, the noise or distraction. Before the start of this presentation, I already gave this as a probable example, and I this is a common interference or a barrier in communication. A noisy environment could actually cause strain to oral communication. Minimizing the noise, both internal, like say for example, what you're feeling, what your what your problems are, and the external noise, like the noise of the fan, the television, or the iPod, you know, can help make communication flow successful. And last one would be your clarity of message and feedback. When the message isn't clear, most of the time the receiver finds it hard to connect with the sender's perception. Feedback is also important because it clarifies the original message. If the feedback is unclear, it could mean that there was a problem with how the message was sent. So we always have to make sure that whenever we we send a message, we ask questions, we clarify. Did you understand? Did you understand what I say? Or sometimes an effective way would be to ask questions. That way, you would be able to clarify if the receiver got the message. All right. So, how do we minimize communication barriers and breakdowns? These are the things to consider. All aspects of communication, the interpretation, the understanding, and feedback. All right? You have to first consider your interpretation of your message. How do you see your message? Is your message really relevant in the conversation? Baka mamaya, yung sinasabi mo doesn't have anything to do with whatever's happening right now. Next would be your understanding. And then after that, what's important is that you transpose it into oral or written communication, and then you check for feedback. Why? Because the feedback of the receiver will clarify if the message was understood very well. And then think carefully about possible barriers, and as much as possible, get rid of these barriers once and for all. Um, or even before the communication takes place. Evaluate the complexity of the message and decide how you could simplify it. As what I've said earlier, as much as possible, be short, be concise, be time bound, and be more specific when it comes to giving your mm, giving your sending off your message. And lastly, determine whether you are meeting or writing your receivers. All right. So it's very important that you would know, am I going to meet them or am I just going to write an email to my receiver? Why? Because this is very important because at that point you will be able to strategize how you're going to compose your message, be it in oral or in written communication. So, what are the things that you should ask yourself? First, who is my receiver? Who's going to listen to me? So, before the start of the communication, you have to think about it. Like right now, um, I have started working on coming up with a video like this because I noticed that most of my students are very fond of watching videos and watching Facebook. It's more of like them just, sitting at their houses, sitting in their rooms, and watching a video presentation and probably taking down notes. You also have to ask, what is the purpose of my communication? That's the why. Why am I saying this? What's the purpose of this? Probably for this presentation, the purpose of this is that so you would know and so that you would be able to um, provide something in the discussion as well as make it good in the quiz right after. Next would be the content of the message. It is very important that you know what you're going to say. So, another thing would also be how, the oral, written, or a combination of both. So, how are you going to send your message? So that's what you call the communication channel. Are you going to say it? That's oral. Are you going to put it down on paper? Are you going to type it in an email notepad? Right? Or are you going to do a presentation like this? So you see, right now, I'm um, I'm doing two things. I'm addressing a visual learner, right? If you're enjoying this video, because you're seeing this, and you see, that the slides are interchanging, and I had pictures in the slides. That's for visual learners, and as a matter of fact, the reason why I'm speaking right now is because I can't just like browse and jump from one slide to another without even speaking. That would be very painful for someone who's very auditory. Okay, where? So you might also want to consider, where are you going to hold the conversation? Is it in a quiet room where there's minimal noise? Are you going to do it in an auditorium? Are you going to do it online like what we're doing right now? So it's also one thing to consider. And lastly, when. You have to know when's the time, how long will it be, and the expected response time. So, before we end, let's revisit our objectives. I think we have already identified the factors affecting conversations, and we have connected these factors with the participants in the communication process. And lastly, we have addressed these problems by considering the different factor areas affecting communication breakdowns. And this is to ensure that effective communication occurs. So thank you for listening and watching this video. This is Factors Affecting Communication, your first presentation for this course, and this has something to do with the surrounding elements in the communication experience. Now, I'd like you to step out of this video presentation and look for the online discussion. There's a task there, and all you need to do is just to type in your thoughts, and you will be graded accordingly. And after that, you can take the quiz under this topic to complete the module. Have a good day.